First of all, I would like to thank Nil Hocam for kindly accepting our invitation, and we thank all of you for sparing your Friday afternoon for this event, but we promise that you will enjoy your time. Before starting the event, I will give the word to our head of department, Dr. Burcu Şentürk. So, Hocam, you may start.
Thank you. So, dear our professors and dear our participants, students, we are very happy to see you here again in our language talk series 4. And I want to thank dear Associate Professor Dr. Nil Korkut-Naykı for her speech for today. So I think I'm on the way. So we are here and we are happy to listen to you. And the stage is yours, Hocam. So thank you very much for your contribution on behalf of all Bartın ELT students and teachers.
Thank you, Hocam, for your words and your kind speech. Well, I would like to announce that we will have a 15 minutes Q&A session after the event. So you may want to take notes about your questions if you think you might forget them. Before I leave the floor to Dr. Korkut-Naykı, I would like to give very brief information about her academic background. Well, Dr. Nil Korkut-Naykı is an associate professor at the Middle East Technical University, and her research areas include literary theory, the novel as a genre, the uncanny and the supernatural in fiction, modernism, postmodernism, narrative theory, literary parody. Well, Dr. Korkut-Naykı received her BA degree from Middle East Technical University in the field of ELT and master's degree and PhD degrees from the same university in English language and literature. She worked as a research assistant in the same department between 1997 and 2004. Then she worked as a lecturer at Başkent University in the Department of Western Language and Literature for 3 years. And currently she works as an associate professor at the Middle East Technical University. She has delivered many talks at various organizations. She has a great number of publications and conference presentations. And she has a lot of books and book chapters such as Kinds of Parody from the Medieval to the Postmodern, An Introduction to Postmodern Literature. Today she will be talking about Alice's adventures in the Wonderland of Language. And Nil Hocam, you may start if you want.
Thank you very much, Özgün, for this nice introduction. And I would like to thank everyone for inviting me here, Bartın University ELT department. It's a pleasure to meet you, to be here and to get a chance to deliver this talk. Now, maybe I can start by sharing my screen with you. Let's see if this works. But no, this is not what because it's not moving right now, so this is not what I want, sorry. Maybe we can try this one. Can you see now?
Yes, we can see, Hocam. But it is not full screen.
Yes, and it's not, the slides are not moving. Okay, now they are, I guess, right?
Yes, they are moving now.
Okay, and it's, but when it becomes full screen, interestingly, yes, I can go back.
Okay,
yes, that's fine now. All right, so I hope everyone can see now. All right. Okay, so the title of my talk is Alice's Adventures in the Wonderland of Language, and of course, I think it is quite self-revealing in the sense that it will be about Alice in Wonderland. A book that I personally love very much, so it's a pleasure to be talking about it, and not just in a literary sense, but in a sense, in a way, trying to link how Alice in Wonderland is related to issues of language and maybe some of the basic tenets of modern linguistics. So that's my aim for today. Now, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the title Alice in Wonderland. You may have read this as children, but even if you haven't, I'm sure perhaps you saw or heard about a film adaptation or animations of the Alice books. And even if you haven't come across any of that, I'm sure you heard the name because it is such an ingrained part of our popular culture that it's for most of us it's a childhood memory, we could say. Yes, it is a childhood memory and a famous children's book. But one question I would like to ask in this talk would be like, is it just a book for children, or does it have maybe other more serious implications for the adult world? And especially for our purposes today, does it have any implications for language, our modern understanding of language, and about questions concerning what language is? Now, before we begin exploring these questions further, we can talk a little perhaps about what the Alice books are about and who the writer is. Lewis Carroll is the writer, as you can see on the left-hand side. His real name is Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, but he used the pen name Lewis Carroll, so that's how we know him. We say Alice in Wonderland in general, but usually, actually, these are two books written several years apart. The first one is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, 1865, and the second one is like a sequel, Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. That's 1871. Now, Lewis Carroll was an interesting personality. He was, of course, a writer, but he was also a mathematician, a logician. He was a deacon, an Anglican deacon, and he was a photographer. And many people who knew him always emphasized how he was very much happy in the company of children and felt much more at home in the world of children compared to the world of adults. That's Lewis Carroll for you. And these Alice books, what are they about, roughly? Now, the first one, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the beginning. It's a very boring spring day, and Alice is sitting on the riverbank with her sister reading a book, but she's terribly bored. And then she's feeling almost drowsy and sleepy, and then suddenly she sees this weird rabbit in a waistcoat with a pocket watch. This rabbit is running very fast and looking at his watch and saying, oh dear, I shall be too late," as though he's trying to be on time for something, and then runs and goes through a rabbit hole. And Alice is so curious that she follows after the rabbit and goes through the rabbit hole herself too. And then she falls into the rabbit hole. So, and it's a long fall. She falls and falls and falls and eventually finds herself in a new world, in quite a fantastic place, if you like. And this new world where she will have her adventures includes lots of talking animals and a living pack of cards, so all sorts of fantastic things that you can imagine. The second one is quite similar in theme, Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. But this time it's probably colder weather because she's indoors and she's playing with her cat in the living room, but she's again very much bored. And there's a mirror, a looking glass in the living room. She wonders, she starts to wonder what the glass is reflecting the living room, but is there anything further? That is, what if I pass through the glass? What would there be another world there? And she gets closer and closer to the mirror, and interestingly, again, she finds that she can pass through the glass, and again finds herself in an entirely new, again, a fantastic world. where there are again strange creatures. And this time there are also chess pieces. It's as though she's moving through a huge chessboard. And these chess pieces have come to life. Of course, there's a king, there's a queen, a bishop, a pawn, etc., and all the interesting adventures there. So basically, these are what the two books are about. And of course, again, being children's stories, they are very humorous. That's why children love them. But most of the time, they are very humorous for adults as well. Actually, we could say most of the humor in these adventures or in these stories comes from a play with language, and it's a very clever and a very interesting play, having a lot of insight into certain qualities about language. So this is what we are going to talk about mainly today. Now, just to give you a taste for what kind of play with language this is and how this leads to humor. Now, in this fantastic world, Alice, of course, it's an entirely new world for her, so she constantly has difficulty understanding what these new creatures she meets are saying. So she very often says, I beg your pardon, so I didn't understand. Could you repeat, right? I beg your pardon. But this phrase, very interestingly, proves quite problematic. For example, this scene, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the figure Humpty Dumpty, right? This egg-like creature. When she meets Humpty Dumpty, she doesn't understand again what he's saying. And I beg your pardon, Alice said with a puzzled air. And then the answer Humpty Dumpty gives is, I'm not offended. Which of course is not what she's expecting, right? And then in another instance, the king, one of on the chessboard, right? I beg your pardon, said Alice. And then the king says, it isn't respectable to beg. So quite humorous, as I hope you can follow the humor here. And of course, the humor here stems mainly from the play with the literal use of language on the one hand and the idiomatic use of language on the other. And shows us how misunderstandings can easily occur like this. And in Alice's world, it is really a world of misunderstandings. Yet another example, Alice meets a mouse, and the mouse wants to tell Alice a story, right? And he begins, he says, mine is a long and sad tale, meaning story, said the mouse, turning to Alice and sighing. It is a long tale, certainly, said Alice, looking down with wonder at the mouse's tail. But why do you call it sad? And she kept on puzzling about it while the mouse was speaking, so that her idea of the tale was something like this. So this is what she imagines, right? A tale made up of words, if you like. It's both a tale, a story, and a tale. Quite funny. And children could laugh at these, and adults could laugh at these very easily. I don't want to go into an analysis of these examples that I just showed you, because there are other examples that I'd like to look at. But this is just to give you a taste of the kind of humor that is often employed throughout the Alice books. Now, all this play is definitely not simplistic, and it has serious implications and insights into language. So we could say these insights that are presented to us through the Alice books, these insights into language, are closely related to some modern theories of linguistics, the modern understanding of language, and especially to some of the basic principles put forward by Ferdinand de Saussure, who could be considered the father of modern linguistics. Now, I'm sure you're taking linguistics courses, and maybe the name of Saussure does not come up as often as the name of Noam Chomsky, for example. But of course, and I'm sure Chomsky departs in many ways from Saussure's understanding, but he actually shares some of the basic principles about language that Saussure initially proposed. And this is, if you like, a modern understanding of language, and it's like the basis of modern linguistics today. I would like to argue here that the Alice books are quite ahead of their time in anticipating and signaling some of these modern ideas about language, about meaning, and about communication, both Saussurean ideas and also ideas that went even beyond Saussure through to, if you like, postmodern times. So that's what I would like to explore throughout. But before we go back to the Alice books, maybe we can briefly talk about what Saussure had to say about language. What was his theory of language, or what was his definition of language? We could, if we want to simplify and summarize, we could say he has these two very significant statements. One is language is a system of arbitrary signs. And the other is language is a system of differences. Now, the key word here, of course, is the word sign. So he defines language as a system of signs. Now, to understand what a sign is, just a minute, I can't move forward again, very interestingly. Oops. All right, you can see now, right? Okay. All right, so language is a system of signs, and to Saussure, the sign is made up of a signifier and a signified. Now, the signifier is the sounds that I hear, or the written image on the paper, if you like, that I see. So, for example, if we go by the example of a tree that we have here, when I say tree, I hear a certain sound pattern, or you hear a certain sound pattern. And when you hear this utterance tree, in your mind, immediately, the concept of a tree is evoked. Of course, if you are speaking the English language, if we're speaking the same language, right? So that is how we understand each other. So any signifier, the sound pattern usually, immediately leads to a certain concept in our minds, and that's the meaning, right? So the word tree, the sound tree, leads to the concept of the tree. There is also the real physical object, the tree, of course, in the outside world, and here I try to represent it with a picture of a tree, as you can see. But in Saussurean understanding, and actually in the understanding of modern linguistics, that real object in the physical world does not really count very much, because that's something separate, and for language to function, we don't need the real object. We'll come back to this issue later on, keep that in mind, but right now let's focus more on the signifier and the signified. So to go back to his statement, I'm sorry, I have difficulty moving here. I don't know why. From one slide to another. Oh, it works this way, just a minute. Okay, let me use the cursor then, the mouse. Okay, so to go back to his statement, language is a system of arbitrary signs. Now let's come to the adjective arbitrary. Now, a sign is made up of a signifier and a signified, but the relationship between these is arbitrary. That is, there is not any natural or intrinsic relationship between the utterance the utterance and the concept that is evoked in our minds. So when I say tree, it's not because of something natural in the sound tree that you are reminded of the concept of a tree, but simply because we have made an arbitrary, that is artificial agreement between ourselves that in the English language that we share, this should lead to this concept. right? This is what is meant by arbitrariness. Apart from this, to return to his second statement, language is a system of differences. Again, in language we don't reach meaning because there is something natural in what is being said, but because we learn to differentiate signifiers from each other. For example, again with the tree example, when I say tree, you understand me not because of something intrinsic to the sound pattern of tree, but simply because you are able to differentiate it on the sound pattern from similar sounds like three, like free, and similarly you're able to differentiate it from similar concepts on the conceptual pattern like a tree and not a shrub, not a flower, not a plant, it's a plant, but not a shrub, not a flower, not a bush, etc. All right, so this is what is meant by a language is a system of differences. We can perhaps return to differences later, but we'll mainly be focusing on the issue of arbitrariness here. Let me begin with a famous example from the Alice books, the dialogue between Alice and Humpty Dumpty. This dialogue is very revealing of the issue of arbitrariness, that is very revealing of how Lewis Carroll gave this issue some thought. Now, Humpty Dumpty is this egg-like creature, as I said before, and he's not really very pleasant to speak to because he's not being very nice to Alice. And when they first meet, this is the dialogue that they go through. So this is Humpty Dumpty speaking. "Don't stand there chattering to yourself like that," Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time, "but tell me your name and business." "My name is Alice, but..." "It's a stupid name enough," Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. "What does it mean?" "Must a name mean something?" Alice asked doubtfully. "Of course it must," Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. "My name means the shape I am, and a good handsome shape it is too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape, almost." So you see again how it's very humorous on the one hand, but how Humpty Dumpty is actually making certain non-Saussurian, if you like, assumptions about language here, because it looks like he doesn't believe in the concept of arbitrariness. That is, if his name is Humpty Dumpty, this name naturally leads to his egg-shaped body, and that there is that natural relationship between the signifier and the signified, according to him. Whereas Alice seems to have doubts about this. So here in this short dialogue, maybe Alice, we could say, is closer to the Saussurian idea about arbitrariness. Now, yet another example would be a very famous poem from the Alice books, a nonsense poem called Jabberwocky. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. It's a nonsense poem because it includes certain words that appear to belong to the English language, but actually don't. And this is actually quite at the beginning of Through the Looking Glass, when Alice has just went through the mirror, and she sees a book there, and she opens the book and comes across this poem, and she wants to read it, but she finds it very hard to read because it's got certain very unknown words to her. So she experiences great difficulty there. So if you bear with me now, I can read this quickly so we'll also get a sense of what's happening here. Jabberwocky. It was brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mom raths outgrabe. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub-jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought, So rested he by the tum-tum tree and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. Oh, Brad, just stay, Callooh-Callay, he chortled in his joy. It was brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves and the mom raths outgrabe. So it sounds very much like full English, right? But quite problematic in some other ways too. Now, if you're not a proficient speaker of the English language and you come across this poem, you may think there are so many unknown words that you have to master here, so it's really difficult to make sense of, right? And even if you're a proficient speaker of the English language, even if you're a native speaker of the English language, you're inevitably led to try to make sense of these unknown words, and maybe have some doubts in your mind. Maybe some of these are words that you really don't know. And for a child too, who is again mastering their native tongue, this could very easily be, because for children there are so many unknown words anyway, right? This could very easily be a poem with lots of unknown words to learn. As you can see, Lewis Carroll is being very, very clever here. And he doesn't stop here, actually. What he does right after this is he opens a parenthetical remark here at the top. And he gives some further information about the unknown words or the new words in the poem Jabberwocky. So the new words in the poem Jabberwocky have given rise to some differences of opinion as to their pronunciation. So it may be well to give instructions on that point. Pronounce slyly as if it were the two words sly, make the g hard in gyre and gimble, and pronounce wrath to rhyme with bus. Now, you see how Lewis Carroll is playing a very clever game here, trying to make children, and even adults, if you like, believe that these are real words less familiar to us. And some pages later, when Alice meets Humpty Dumpty, she complains to Humpty Dumpty that she couldn't understand this poem. And Humpty Dumpty is a very knowing character here, and he's very sure of himself. And he starts to explain the unknown words. So he says, well, that's enough to begin with, Humpty Dumpty interrupted. There are plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when you begin broiling things for dinner. That'll do very well, said Alice. And slithy? Well, slithy means live and slimy. Live is the same as active. You see, it's like a portmanteau. There are two meanings packed up into one word. So you see what's happening here. These words, these nonsense words actually, are already becoming a part of language through such explanations that Humpty Dumpty and actually Lewis Carroll is providing for us. So very playfully, in a very playful manner, Lewis Carroll is already creating a new community of speakers agreeing on the meaning of these words. And it is all happening, as you can see, very arbitrarily, because we are simply learning in an artificial manner to couple these signifiers with certain signifiers. So these examples, and there are so many others in the Alice books, show us how Lewis Carroll is providing lots of insight into this issue. Now, we've been talking about all this in relation to Saussure's theory of language and the sign. Saussure actually influenced the school of thought called structuralism in the first half of the 20th century. Now, structuralism was influential in many fields such as linguistics, sociology, anthropology, and literary studies. But then after the 1950s and 1960s, thinkers started to question some of the basic principles of structuralism. The most basic principle of structuralism is the sign, that is what we just talked about, being made up of a signifier and a signifier, And Saussure argued that the signifier and the signified always fully coincide with each other. They always overlap. So he even used this metaphor, like the signifier and the signified are like two sides of a single sheet of paper. You cannot separate them. So he suggested that that is how we communicate, how we make meaning in language. So whenever someone utters something, we immediately think of the right meaning, the correct signified, and there is no problem about that. This is what Saussure argued, and this is what structuralism as a school of thought is based on. But then in the second half of the 20th century, after the 1950s and 1960s, there came the post-structuralists. And these are actually more postmodern oriented thinkers, if you like, more postmodern oriented thinkers about language and meaning and all that. And they said, no, the sign doesn't really work like that. And the sign does not always work very smoothly like that. So they said, when we utter a signifier, that signifier may lead to more than one signified, may lead to more than one meaning. That is, and it's not that easy to communicate in language. So that's what they argue. To give you an example here, a very simple example. For example, when you think about the word bear, it's a signifier, but especially out of context, it could lead to so many different signifiers, like it could mean animal, carry, stand, give birth, and maybe some others if we want to think further. Now, this is a very simple example, but this is how post-structuralists started to question Saussure's understanding of the sign. And what they suggested instead of the emphasis on the sign is they suggested the process of signification, which meant something like where you cannot really reach a final signifier. Now, if you look at the bottom here, so they suggested when we utter a signifier, that signifier seems to lead to a meaning, which is the signified. But once we reach that meaning, that signifier also immediately becomes another signifier. And now that new signifier should lead to yet another signifier, and inevitably that signifier will become another signifier, and so the process continues, in theory, endlessly. The metaphor they use to explain this situation is a dictionary metaphor. Imagine yourself looking up a new word in a dictionary, in a monolingual dictionary. You look up a word that you don't know, so you're trying to reach the meaning, the signifier of a signifier. There's an explanation for that, but within that explanation, there may be some other words that you don't know. So you go and look them up too. And then within these new explanations, there may be some other words that you may have to look up. So basically, in theory again, you could look up in the dictionary endlessly, right? Forever. This is what they meant by the process of signification. And this is how they suggest that actually language does not lead to meaning in a very smooth manner. So to summarize one more time, structuralists influenced by Saussure believed that you could communicate much more easily in language thanks to the sign. But to post-structuralists, that is these more postmodern thinkers, reaching full meaning in language, reaching full communication is almost impossible. You have to create the illusion that it is possible, because otherwise we couldn't function in language, we couldn't function in society. And again, interestingly, this idea of endless signification that is proposed by the post-structuralists can be found to a certain extent in some of the jokes that the Alice books include. So again, in that sense, these books are quite ahead of their time. The jokes I showed you at the beginning, the I beg your pardon jokes, could be seen as one of those, but there are even better ones. For example, this. Now, here Alice is sitting between the white queen and the red queen, these chess figures. And she's very nervous because they keep asking her questions and she has to answer correctly. And they're asking her about bread, how bread is made. Here the red queen began again. Can you answer useful questions, she said. How is bread made? I know that, Alice cried eagerly. You take some flour. Where do you pick the flour, the white queen asked. In a garden or in the hedges? Well, it isn't picked at all, Alice explained. It's ground. How many acres of ground, said the white queen. You mustn't leave out so many things. So of course it's quite humorous, right? It looks like it's impossible to reach full meaning with so many misunderstandings. And it really turns out to be impossible that Alice will get to the end of this recipe, and so the conversation just drops off at some point. So it looks all absurd, but such dialogues, such absurd-looking dialogues, actually give important insights into how communication in language is quite difficult, and full communication, and how it's more of an endless process of signification. And we could even argue that when I'm giving you this talk right now, that is from a post-structuralist perspective, well, I'm telling you things and you're understanding certain things, but from that perspective, it's never ever possible that you will understand what I want you to exactly understand, and we'll just play this game of illusion of communicating to a certain extent. Now, I would like to move on to yet another question related to language, a philosophical question about the relationship between language and reality, and that will be my last point. Now, this again starts with Saussure and his modern theory of language. And although post-structuralists questioned many of the things Saussure said about the sign, they actually agreed in this respect with Saussure. Remember how at the beginning of the talk I talked about the sign on the one hand and the reference on the other, the reference being the real physical object in the real world. What Saussure suggested is when we think of language, we should not consider the real physical world outside. It's got nothing to do with language as a system of signs. So the sign, although it seems related to the physical world, should not be understood as corresponding on a one-to-one basis with the physical world. Now, I hope this will become clearer through an example from the Alice books, because Lewis Carroll seems to share again a similar idea with Saussure here. Now, here, this is again the beginning of Alice's adventures in Wonderland, and she's falling through the rabbit hole, and it's a very long fall. It's a deep well, and she has time as she's falling to look around her. And there are shelves, and she picks up a jar. So this is the scene. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her. She looked at the sides of the well and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labeled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment, it was empty. Now, this looks like such an unimportant description. But from the perspective of the relationship between language and reality, or let's say between sign and reference in Saussurean terms, it makes a lot of sense. The sign here is the label orange marmalade on the jar. And when Alice picks it, she has this naive notion that whenever she picks a jar labeled orange marmalade, she will reach the real physical orange marmalade. But it doesn't have to be like that. And as we can see here, it isn't like that. Yet another example. She's just fallen down now. She's on the ground, and she finds herself in an empty place with a table. On the table, there's a bottle, and it says, "This time, she found a little bottle on the table and round its neck a paper label with the words "Drink Me" beautifully printed on it in large letters. It was all very well to say "Drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. "No, I'll look first," she said, "and see whether it's marked poison or not." However, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice ventured to taste it, and finding it very nice, she very soon finished it off. Now, would you say Alice is being wise here in drinking from this unknown bottle? Well, I have my doubts, right? Just because it doesn't say poison. So again, you see how Alice very innocently and naively links the sign intimately with the reference. And to her, if there is no sign, then there is no reference. And if there is a sign, there should be a reference. But of course, that's not how it works, right? Alice is lucky here because the drink is not really, doesn't turn out to be poisonous, but it causes her, it does something to her. It causes her to change shape, continue to change size continuously. So these pieces again show us Lewis Carroll's very intelligent insights into language and its relationship with reality. And come to think of it, whenever we use language, we don't ever need the real physical objects, right? We can create worlds in language that we have never seen at all. We can think of or imagine objects and utter them, and in that sense, we can create them in language, in this world of science, but they need not even exist in the physical world of reality. And in fact, this is also what literature is about, because it's not real. It's something created through language. Now, in the Alice books, there's again a very interesting scene, and that's my last example for you, relating to this idea. Now, this is with the interesting twins Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and they're making Alice upset because they keep claiming that she's not real and she's just a figure in the king's dream. "Well, it's no use you're talking about waking him," the Red King said Tweedledum, "when you're only one of the things in his dream. You know very well you're not real." "I am real," said Alice, and began to cry. "You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying," Tweedledee remarked. "There's nothing to cry about." "If I wasn't real," Alice said, "I shouldn't be able to cry." "I hope you don't suppose those are real tears," Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of great contempt. Here the idea of reality is related to a dream, but actually, if we want to think a little further about this, it's also true that Alice is not real. So Tweedledum and Tweedledee are quite right in that respect. She's just a creation of language, isn't she? She may be so real to us because she's such a popular creation, but in fact, she's not real. She has never been a part of the real physical world that we inhabit. And you could interpret this scene with Tweedledum and Tweedledee as an again, important insight into this idea that she's just a creature of language and she's got nothing to do with the physical reality. And to be able to create characters and worlds, we don't really need the physical reality. These are my examples, and I hope I have been able to convey to you some of the insights and suggestions the Alice books are making about language and reality and meaning and communication. There are, of course, so many other things that we could talk for hours and hours about, lots of other very, very progressive implications that the Alice books are making. But I think we need to stop here. In the light of what we have discussed, we could ask ourselves one more time if the Alice books are just children's books or if there's much more to them than that. And as I have tried to suggest throughout, these books actually anticipate many of the modern and even postmodern ideas about language, meaning, communication, and reality. And in that sense, they are quite fascinating. Thank you. That's all. So let me stop share.
Nil Hocam, thanks a lot for this extremely fruitful and at the same time inspiring speech. I believe we all felt energized even at this hour of Friday. But first of all, we apologize for the organizational problems. I think we were a bit unlucky, but again, we thank everyone for joining us. Now we can have questions, and you can use the raise hand button or write your questions in the chat, and I can read your questions if you don't prefer turning on your camera or microphone. Are there any questions?
So it looks everything was crystal clear. But no, it shouldn't be like that because that's just what I said, right? It shouldn't be crystal clear. Okay, sorry, it's getting dark here. Right.
Hocam, can I ask you a question?
Yes, please, Özgün.
Well, are there any books like Alice in Wonderland that you find out it's not only for children, but it's only for for us, to like these kind of linguistic things or language things?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and that actually makes us think about children's literature and what it really is. And actually, most books that have been originally planned for children, or maybe they weren't originally planned for children but turned out to be children's books, or vice versa, they often have a lot to say to adults, and especially when humor like this is created, and there are jokes and all that. These jokes created by these intelligent adults, of course, I think have a lot to say about the adult world and adult questions too. One thing that comes to my mind, another is, for example, Gulliver's Travels, which again could be read or seen as children's books, but it's of course much more than that, right? And Gulliver's Travels also, interestingly, there are some parts in it where which are preoccupied with language and what it is and all that. Yeah, that's one thing that comes to mind, but I'm sure if we thought more deeply, we could come across others.
Thank you, Hocam, for your answer. So are there any questions? And Joshua Hocam just raised his hand, and Sinem Hocam raised her hand too. Sinem Hocam, you may talk.
Joshua Hocam, you can go as well.
Okay, thank you. I didn't even realize that I had raised my hand because I was searching for the button that you mentioned. I must have found it even though I didn't even see that. What I felt, of course, through Nil Korkut-Naykı's talk and through the examples is that Lewis Carroll was very much ahead of his time and made some very valid observations about language, valid at that time and still valid so many years after, about the whole thing about language and communication being a much, much more complex process than we are usually aware of. And I think this, of course, is what's happening with modern linguistics also. We keep realizing that it's more, language is something that is much more complex than we thought up until now. No matter how much we discover, there's more and more things to be discovered. I think I was thinking about Jabberwocky there. Some people looking at this, they'll say this is nonsense. But I mean, but we can still make sense out of it, can't we? Because of our knowledge of English grammar, because of our knowledge of English syntax, because of our knowledge of English morphology. Even though we may not be able to identify the meanings of words in the poem, we know whether it's an adjective or whether it's a verb, or whether it's a noun. And so there is meaning there. We can't say it's meaning. I mean, nonsense and meaninglessness may be two different things. Yeah, I hope I haven't talked too much.
Thank you, Hocam.
Thank you.
Sinem Hocam, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Nil Hocam, for this talk. And thank you, the organizers. It was very insightful. Mine is more like a commentary than a question. I think Alice in Wonderland belongs to Victorian era fiction. And in that time, realism was the dominant mode, and the socioreal linguistics, we see signifier and signified corresponded to each other with no problem. But even at that time, according to your comments, Hocam, this problematization was there, and I think it was very ahead of its time. And the trace that we see in postmodern fiction is there at that time, so it is very interesting to see that.
Yeah, I find it fascinating too, and that of course shows us a very, intelligent mind, very much insightful about these matters. And of course, it's very interesting that he's very much interested in issues of language, but he's also a mathematician, and the two go together, which is also maybe the fact that he's a mathematician also leads him to consider issues of language with more insight, because we could say both are systems, human systems created, right?
Exactly. Thank you, Hocam.
Nergis Hocam, well, if you want, can ask.
Yeah, thank you for the Hocam beautiful presentation, creative and edifying. Actually, I like the fact that you are bringing the story, with this new light, because I think Alice is a very interesting character, because she's a child, but also very mature and very smart, and it's like she's actually an adult. She's not a child even. But in the light of what you have put into forward, this signifier and signified issue, actually there's a scene. She says, she after changing from, small to big, and she's kind of confused as well. She says, okay, 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13. This multiplication table, even it doesn't signify, she says. She uses that word here. I think, it's great that there is a direct, even, reference to the signification issue. I think it's very interesting. I just wanted to make this comment, and thank you.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, that's a very good example too. Thank you, Nergis.
Çiğdem Hocam had a question, and then I will give the word to Semra Hocam to ask her question.
Thank you, Özgün. Nil Hocam, thank you very much for this inspirational talk. I truly wish that I had a chance to listen to you during my undergraduate studies. I definitely would have a better understanding of what was expected from me in my literature and in my linguistics classes. So thank you very much. While I was listening to you, I just Googled, the type of studies conducted on on the novel, and it seems that though it is, as I take it, it is a fantasy book written. A novel for children, right? It's a literary piece of work, but it seems that the studies conducted are more in number, those concerning linguistics. And it seems that there are functional, semantic, syntactic perspectives brought. Then I started wondering, actually, what was, probably you don't know the answer, but you might have a feeling, what was the aim of Carroll, actually, while producing this work? Was the intention, literature-based or linguistics-based? Because I could not actually decide for which field it serves better.
Yeah.
I will definitely use it actually from now on in my classes.
Yeah, it's definitely a very good material to use, I think, in linguistics classes. It's an interesting question what you're asking. What did he have in mind, or what, or maybe he wasn't, because we inevitably, because of our academic context and background, we inevitably try to maybe separate interests into certain fields and all that. But maybe maybe he was simply interested in language and what language is and does, and of course literature is also part of it, right? Because literature is also part of language. So this maybe it is a shortcoming of our own maybe more modern perspectives, that we inevitably try to compartmentalize different interests into certain fields. I also do the same, just like you do and everyone else does, because that's what we are expected in a sense to do. But maybe he was simply very much interested about these philosophical questions about what language is, which covers everything, right? That is language as a whole. I don't know if that's an answer, but that's what came to my mind right now.
I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, lots of inspirational opinions. Yeah, I mean, I have also been questioning this, so I think I'll continue reading further on the novel.
So I think very, yes, especially for linguistics courses, I think it's very, very good tool. There are so many different examples.
Thank you very much, Hocam.
Semra Hocam, you may ask your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Nil Hocam, for this enlightening presentation. It was really enjoyable to watch. Thank you again. As we know, structure can be helpful in the understanding of sentences containing new words, because English belongs to those languages characterized by relatively fixed word order, as we know, and there are some certain grammatical structures and patterns that determine the creation of utterances. And so in this regard, Carroll's poem is a very interesting, Jabberwocky. So, Hocam, can we regard this poem as meaningless or hardly decodable, maybe in the absence of such a syntactic framework?
Well, I don't think we can call it meaningless, although it is in the category of nonsense poetry, by the way. That is, in literature, we would put it in the category of nonsense poetry. There is such a genre, if you like. But I don't think we can really call it meaningless because there is actually, that is, it's not going against the syntactic or morphological or other structures of English. If it were, then it would be, we would be totally lost, I guess. But it is, that's exactly what it's doing. It's playing around with our existing shared arbitrary knowledge of the English language, but creating these new words, and if you like, I don't know if it's creating any new grammatical structures, mainly words actually, but it's very cleverly adding to our vocabulary there, because once you've read the poem, I think it's part of our vocabulary now, at least at this community here, would agree to a certain extent about what brillig means or what sliding means, right? And so in that sense, I don't think we can call it completely meaningless. But it's, yes, it's very interesting pursuit to think about that poem further and further. And it's really very, very clever. It could be, as again, to return to Çiğdem Hoca's question, I think it could be read both in the literature class, as nonsense poetry and what it suggests perhaps, but it could also be analyzed in a linguistics class to try to figure out how it makes sense and why it does make sense in the way it does.
Thank you so much.
So are there any questions? If it's not, well, Nil Hocam, thank you for accepting our invitation again, and everyone here for joining us today. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is our first talk for the term, and we already have a date for the next language talks. It will take place on May 18th. So you can follow us on social media to get updates on our series. And thank you so much for joining us today. And
Thank you very much.
that's all for
It's
today.
been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, we call it a day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice week,
Tabii
evening,
hocam. Thank you very much too.
weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Nil Hocam, and thank you, everyone. See you at another meeting. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. See you all.
Bye-bye.